So I asked ChatGPT to make me a high hydration sourdough bread recipe. Let's see if ChatGPT is a master recipe developer. Hi, I'm Sune and I'm a food geek. So I'm sure most of you are aware of ChatGPT. It's an artificial intelligence chatbot that is shown to be able to do quite extraordinary things. Things like writing code, making poems, or even scripts for your YouTube videos. One of my viewers by the name of Tony Barbin sent me a sourdough recipe formed as a poem that he got from ChatGPT. Here's my favorite part. Let it cool before you slice the crusty crust. The airy inside, enjoy toasted with butter and jam, your sourdough bread, the perfect exam. So ChatGPT should be more than capable of making a regular sourdough recipe. I asked it to make me a high hydration sourdough recipe. I decided not to tinker with it at all, but did try to ask it questions like adding whole grain or adding salt in the beginning, but it wasn't the initial response, and I wanted to make its initial recipe. I asked it to simplify the recipe twice, giving us 4 loaves to try out today. So we'll be trying out 4 different recipes. My master recipe scaled to the same hydration that ChatGPT gave me, which was 81.8%. The initial recipe given by ChatGPT, the simplified version, and the even simpler version. So let me highlight the differences. The initial recipe gave us a loaf with 500 grams of bread flour, 80% water, 20% starter, and 2% salt. The subsequent recipes did not change this formula. What changed was the method, not substantially, but somewhat. The first recipe uses fermentation, mix all the ingredients except salt. After 30 minutes, mix the salt in. Then you're supposed to do 4 to 6 stretch and folds every 30 minutes. Then the dough rests and rises 50%. Then it's baked at 230 degrees Celsius, 450 degrees Fahrenheit in a Dutch oven for 30 minutes and then browned for 15 to 20 minutes. It's important to note that no details about shaping or scoring are included, so I will make these loaves as unshapen boules and won't score them. The simpler version is the same recipe but with details removed. In this case, it doesn't specify the number of stretch and folds. It also tells us that the dough should rise until it's increased in size. The even simpler version tells us to do several stretch and folds over 2 hours, but then tells us the dough should double during bulk. Since the simpler version doesn't specify the rise during bulk, I decide to go with the midway point between the 2 other recipes, so 75%. I was a bit disappointed that ChatGPT's idea of simplifying the recipe was to leave out details instead of making it more straightforward. One thing that will make a massive difference between my master recipe and the ChatGPT ones are that there are no whole grain flour in the dough, making for a huge difference in texture both during the process and the baking of the dough. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon. You can also buy some merch, use the super thanks, or use the links in the description for tools and ingredients. Those were the words. This is the experiment. This is an experiment, not a recipe. If you'd like to know how to make sourdough bread, there's a link in the description for my master recipe. So I'll show you how I've made all these loaves, but I won't give you any details. If you're interested in the ChatGPT's response to me, I've added a link to that in the description. To ensure enough time between the fermentation for each ChatGPT loaf, I stagger the dough mixing by an hour. I've edited the process so you can see how everything went down. First, I mix my master recipe and the initial ChatGPT recipe. Then 30 minutes later, I mix the salt in the ChatGPT recipe. "30 minutes more, I do first set of stretch and folds for my master recipe and the ChatGPT, and I mix the simpler recipe. Now it's getting hairy. 30 minutes later, I do the second set of stretch and folds for my master and the ChatGPT recipe. Mix the salt in for the simpler recipe, and I mix the even simpler recipe. 30 minutes later, I do the first stretch and fold for the simpler recipe and mix the salt for the even simpler recipe. I do the last set of stretch and folds for my master recipe and the ChatGPT recipe. I know I was supposed to do 4 folds, but I forgot. The dough is plenty strong though. "30 minutes more and I do the second set of stretch and folds for the simpler recipe and the first set for the even simpler recipe. Hang in there, we're getting close to being done with this part of the process. Third set of stretch and folds for the simpler recipe and the second for the even simpler. Then I do the last set of stretch and folds for the even simpler recipe. Now everything is fermenting. The master recipe is in the proofer for 25% growth, the ChatGPT for 50% growth, the simpler recipe for 75% growth, and the even simpler recipe for 100% growth. After the master recipe is fermented, I pre-shape the dough. And then I final shape the dough. And put it in the fridge for 8 hours. So as the ChatGPT recipe is getting close to 50% growth, I heat the oven to 230 degrees Celsius, 450 degrees Fahrenheit. I will show you all of the baking simultaneously, but the ChatGPT loaves were baked for 30 minutes covered and 20 minutes uncovered, and the master recipe was baked for 25 minutes covered and 25 minutes uncovered. Then I take them all out and let them cool to room temperature. Okay, let's have a look at the crumb. So those loaves were not bad, but I've got to say that without my knowledge of sourdough baking, I doubt I've been able to make good loaves using the ChatGPT recipes. That's precisely what many beginner recipes suffer from and why I try to be so incredibly detailed in my recipes. Interestingly, there was about the same amount of oven spring from 50% rise to 100% rise during bulk, but the most significant difference was in the crumb. Remember, if open crumb is your goal, fermentation is vital, but the flour that you use is as essential. If you want to make open crumb sourdough bread, check out my recipe in the card above. Today, I surpassed 140,000 subscribers, which is hard to understand. I'd like to thank you all for following, watching, commenting, and being so incredibly lovely. I think I have the best followers of any YouTube channel, and I try my best to give back to all of you. I aim to do this full time, but I need more views. You can help by sharing my videos with anybody who could benefit from them. Thank you. I hope you learned something today. See you next time.